Good morning. My name's Rebecca Fisher. I invite you to sit as you are willing or able. And on behalf of First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware, I'd like to welcome everyone who's in the sanctuary, everyone who's watching the live stream, and those of you who are watching a recording on video later on YouTube. I'm so glad you're all here. We aspire to welcome everybody, no matter what body you are in, no matter your ethnicity, your gender, your sexuality, your economic status, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey. And when you come to our community, I hope that you feel comfortable showing up as your whole self, with all of your doubts, all of your dreams, your questions, and your insights. You may have picked up a flyer on the way in with this week's programs, and I hope you can stay after church because from starting at noon, we're going to have a program right here in the sanctuary. It's part of our live stream series called Delaware's Indigenous Tribe with Ruth Ann Purchase. So right here, you can learn about the Lenape, and you can also examine your own prejudices and stereotypes. An online Zoom option will be available for those of you on computers. This month's Soul Matters theme is justice and equity. And today, Reverend Larry Pierce will preach about Ida B. Wells, journalist, abolitionist, feminist, a woman who understood intersectionality before we had a word for it. I'm looking forward to learning more about her and hearing Reverend Larry's ideas on how we can build on her legacy. And now, let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship.
What a wonderful way to begin our worship service this morning. Thank you, Children's Choir, and thank you, Cindy, for your help with that. This morning, you might notice that on the platform here is what is called a wonder box. We've borrowed it from the children's religious exploration program, and it's a custom for a child to come up, open the box, reach in, and show us what's in the box. So in a moment, I'm going to ask for a volunteer child to come up and do that. Yeah, you can, right there. Okay? Now, before we even open the box, let's just think about worship as a place where we come to wonder about things, and also worship as a place where we can experience wonder and awe about life itself. So, with no further delay, do I have a volunteer to come up and reach in? Go ahead, come on up and reach in the box and pull out what is ever in the box and hold it up for us to see. Well, what is it?
It's a heart.
It's a heart. Thank you. So, have a heart today. Who knows what the French word for heart is? Cœur. So that leads me to my statement about courage. Courage has to have heart, has to draw from the heart. Oftentimes, in order to persist with courage, to keep pulling through even when you may be discouraged, requires us to tap into the strength of our hearts. So, Miss Catherine is going to have a story about courage. I'm going to be sharing a story about a woman with courage, Ida B. Wells. And so let us think today on what it is that gives us courage, that builds courage within us and among us as we begin our worship today. And this piece of wisdom from Ida B. Wells, a woman of courage. There must always be a remedy, she says, for wrong and injustice if we only know how to find it.
Barch family, I'd invite you to come on up. We have some special chalice lighters this morning. So if you have a chalice at home, and I know you do, get your matches if you haven't already found them, and light the chalice along with us. After the chalice, we're going to sing the chalice lighting song that the children, I believe, use in their worship. No? No. Anyway, I understood the kids know this song, so we'll all sing it, though. Rise Up, O Flame. And then right after that will be our opening hymn. And you still need to stand after that for our unison affirmation. It's a lot of standing. You'll make it. So our words are, you want to stay up here while we say the words? You don't have to if you can't manage, that's fine. We gather into this circle. We gather into this circle to care, to dream, to envision, to embody, and achieve the compassion we dream, the justice we envision, and the dignity of each in an ever-growing circle of love and justice. Good job. Thanks. So please rise in body or spirit.
Vision.
Now our unison affirmation. Please join me. First Unitarian Church of Wilmington is a beloved community that nourishes minds and spirits, fights injustice, and transforms the world through loving action.
Today's story is called The Dog and the Heartless King. It is adapted from an Indian folktale in the book From Long Ago and Many Lands by Sophia Fawes. Once upon a time, there lived a king who cared for nobody but himself. He grew richer and richer from the high taxes he forced his people to pay, while the people became poorer and poorer. The king lived in a gorgeous palace, while the people who built it for him lived in run-down huts. The king's table was always heaped with delicious foods, while most of his people ate one plain meal a day, if that. But the heartless king did not care. If he had what he wanted, that was enough for him. One day, a hunter came to the palace gate. Now, the hunter brought with him an enormous dog to present as a gift to the king. The king was fond of hunting, and this enormous dog fascinated him. So he accepted the gift. As soon as the king accepted the dog, it began to bark. Now, this dog's bark was not an ordinary bark. It was as loud as thunder and actually shook the palace walls. And the dog wouldn't stop barking. It barked and barked and barked, and no one could stop it. "What's wrong with your dog?" the king shouted. "She's not my dog," shouted the hunter back. "She's your dog, and she's hungry." Immediately, the king ordered servants to bring as much food as the dog could eat. But no matter how much food they brought the dog continued to bark. As you can imagine, the king was not happy. "Take your dog and leave this kingdom," the king ordered. "I can't," said the hunter. "She's not my dog. She's your dog." "Will nothing satisfy the hunger of this enormous dog?" the king shouted. "Nothing that is easy for you to give," said the hunter. "Your Majesty, there are people in this kingdom who eat all the food and do not share it with those who work the fields and grow the food. As a result, there are people who are always hungry. The dog feels the hunger of every person in this kingdom. And as long as the dog feels that hunger, he will bark." Now, the king thought that the people of his kingdom were simply supposed to always do exactly what he wanted. It never occurred to him that a king should think of the happiness of the people, of anyone except for himself. So the king realized something needed to change. And the king decided to open the barns, to provide food for all of the people. And so the people were able to eat. Now, the granaries of the kingdom were opened, and over time, the dog began to bark less. And he laid down next to the king's chair. The dog was satisfied. And everywhere in the land, the people were content. For the next few years, the enormous dog stayed by the king's side to ensure that the king never reverted to his old ways. A few times, the dog barked to remind the king about justice, and each time the king remembered the important lesson he had learned. Finally, the dog was convinced the king truly understood the meaning of justice. And one morning, she simply got up and walked out of the palace and went to bark for justice in a different land. In the story, the dog barked because she wanted justice for everyone. She barked to make things fair. She was a watchdog for justice. And now, please join me in singing Our Children Out, and I ask the children to please wait by the door for me. Oh, Hava, why don't you put, there we go. Thank you.
Let us gather together now for a time of prayerful meditation. Feeling your body held by the chair in which you are sitting. Feeling your feet caressing the earth as the earth caress your feet. Feeling the blessed gift of breath as it moves naturally and rhythmically through your body. Find a place of stillness within. Remaining in this posture of stillness and quiet, I will share with you a meditation written by Ira Progoff from his collection, The Well and the Cathedral. We have made the journey towards stillness, into the well of our own self, and beyond ourself, into the moving waters of the underground stream within us. Downward and upward, inward again, we are here in the waters beyond the well. Many awarenesses have been given to us in the waters beyond the well. Symbols have opened to us. Riddles of life, visions of things to come. The struggles and harmonies in the movement of the universe have disclosed themselves to us one by one. And here, in the underground stream, that place of inner strength, that place of renewal and nourishment within, we realize that many others in earlier times have entered their wells and have gone inward until they reach the waters beyond the well, where we are now in our own imagination. In ancient days, Jacob went down his well, and when he returned, he placed a stone for remembrance. In his way, Moses went down, and Isaiah and Ezekiel, Lao Tzu and Zoroaster, the Buddha, Jesus of Nazareth, Teresa and Juliana, Meister Eckhart, George Fox, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Walt Whitman, and many others have gone down their well to the underground stream within. These and many more have been here, some famous in history, others unknown, but each, by direct beholding, discovered many marvelous things that were shown to them, or that they recognized and drew to themselves in the underground stream. Those who have gone down their well into the underground stream have done many things upon returning to the surface of their lives. Some have written books. Some have painted and sculpted. Some have made philosophies. Some have stated truths. And some have lived their lives more fully, with a dedication to justice, with an inward abundance, and with greater wisdom than was possible before. So in the shared silence that follows, let's take a time to connect with that underground stream within the well of our own being, that source of strength, of courage, of inspiration, of renewal and nourishment that is always available to us to draw from. Let us go to that inner well, be nurtured by the stream, the Spirit within, so that we may, upon returning, bring the gifts that are ours to give from that place. Let's join now in a shared silence. In our hearts, each day and each week, we carry burdens, and we also carry joys. I'd like to invite you in a moment, after reflecting on what burden or joy you might be holding, to share your burdens and then your joys in this room. But let's pause for a moment so that all of us in this room may connect with our own hearts and what we are carrying there. And in a moment, I'll invite those in the chat or those in the room to speak aloud, if you care to do so, whatever burden or joy you are holding this day. If you care to do so, put your hands out like this so we can symbolize holding each other's burdens. And if you have a burden that you'd like to share aloud in this room, let's feel the weight of those burdens together. Who has a burden that they would like to share? Barbara. Indeed, let us feel the weight of each of these burdens as we slowly bring these burdens to our own heart and hold them there for a moment for one another. Are there some joys that you're also holding, or that maybe are holding you during this time that you would like to share in this room or in the chat? What joys, if I were to kind of sweep the room and gather some of the joys that might be present here, what are some of those joys? Our hearts are big enough to hold both our concerns and our joys. And so may all whose names were spoken and those unspoken find peace and healing this day as we sing together our music for meditation.
Flowing
In the founding story of this congregation, the First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, we say that it came into existence when a group of liberal Christians had conversations about religion and how their understanding of faith could influence their lives. Those conversations led to the decision of the group to establish our church, the First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware. In February 1866, the first document stated, "The undersigned propose to associate themselves for the purpose of forming and sustaining in the city of Wilmington a society of the Unitarian faith, and to take the earliest practical measures therefore." That's how they spoke back then. But what really stands out for me is that date. That date. What was the date? Right. It has always struck me that this congregation had its formation during such a critical time in this nation's history. This period of our congregation's founding coincides with the end of the Civil War, the beginning of the so-called Reconstruction period, and a period of both victory and turmoil, peace and upheaval. I have wondered, what was it like for our ancestors to gather congregation during a time when collective grief and trauma from the Civil War had to still be present? What was it like when the freedom from slavery came to those of African descent and a process of so-called Reconstruction was underway to establish equity and parity for people formerly held as slaves? And it was just the beginning of that process. What was it like for our ancestors to start a church in 18 at a time when the government was in disarray following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865? What was it like? What did it take for a group of people to start a church then, at that juncture in history? How was it to be gathering a congregation when in 1866 Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill? The first bill extended the life of an agency Congress had created in 1865 to oversee this transition from slavery to freedom. And the second bill, the Civil Rights Bill, defined all persons born in the United States as national citizens who were to enjoy equality before the law. And then, subsequently, Southern states were given under President Johnson the right to form their own laws and eventually began to deviate from the promises of the Reconstruction. Our ancestors decided to carry forward the promise of the liberal Christianity of their time, the Unitarian faith of their time that held that humans were not innately deprived, that all were children of God and deserved the respect and the dignity of being human, that we could bring about our own salvation through inner work and caring action in the world, that there was a distinction between the religion about Jesus as taught in other Christian churches, and the religion of Jesus, which imagined that Jesus' moral character was available to all of us. And what was it like to have that faith that what we brought about in this world, in the here and now, was as important, if not more so, than whatever happened in the hereafter? It may not seem like such a big deal to us sophisticated, rational, intellectual, Unitarian Universalists today, but it was a big deal then. to establish such an optimistic faith in a time when upheavals were still settling down and still rising up in spite of it all. This is the heritage that the ancestors of this congregation have passed on to us. And I want to honor that spirit that infused us from our very beginning. It was during this time. What was the founding date of the church? Okay, great. Okay. It was during this time that Ida B. Wells, who has inspired my focus with you this morning, was just beginning her own life and work. I came to first know of her from a friend, a Unitarian Universalist colleague, Reverend Carlton Elliott Smith, who actually grew up in Holly Springs, Mississippi, where Wells was born. Books about her were not available in my elementary school library. Anyone here ever read a book about her early on in their lives? There are reasons for that I'll get to. I have come to appreciate that her life and work deserves more recognition now and can be an exemplar, and that she can be an exemplar for us in these times in which we live. And some have actually called her a prophet for our time. Ida Wells was born in 1862 into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And when freedom came in 1865, her father was instrumental in establishing a school for African American kids in Holly Springs, and Ida would attend that school. Ida Wells grew and matured during this time following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction, when at last the promise of equity and parity for people of African descent would seem to be realized. Yet, there would be events that would dash these hopes. Again and again, Ida Wells would encounter the gap between the promise and the reality. Again and again, Ida Wells would experience how the system could conspire against the promise and the hope of equity and freedom. It was in these tensions that Ida Wells' life would be formed, where she would find her voice as an African American woman and a relentless journalist, and become an inspiration and advocate for justice as she called out the horrific continuation of the denigration and the outright death of those of African descent in post-Civil War America. Reconstruction and post-construction period of the American South, these events were happening, and she put a spotlight on them. When it was declared in the 1876 presidential election that no candidate received a majority of the electoral votes, hold on as I take a breath here, a 15-member commission decided who the president would be. It was then that Ruth Rutherford Hayes was chosen as president, and I quote, by promising to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South that were sent there to reinforce the laws and the practices of Reconstruction. What happened was the beginning of what some writers have called neo-slavery. And by 1890, many laws limiting the voting rights and freedoms of those of African descent eventually became codified in what we have known to be called the Jim Crow laws, which were in effect until our modern civil rights movements in the 1960s. So what became of the promise and the hope for those who had been enslaved gradually reverted back to restriction and racism. Ida B. Wells personally experienced this transition towards freedom and dignity and its gradual reversal. What was it? What was it that formed this relentless spirit and this prophetic voice that would become Ida B. Wells? As I explore this question with you this morning, rather than focus just on the facts of her life, the surface of her life, I want to invite us into a dialogue with her life. I want us to recognize that however different or distant we may be from her experience and her historical moment, that there is something available to her inner life that can also guide us, whoever we are, whatever time we are in. Moreover, given the time that we are in, I want to invite us into finding what wisdom and inquiry she leads us to in our time, which requires us to show up, which requires us to, I knew you'd get it, requires us to show up again and again and again. When her parents both died from the yellow fever epidemic, Ida B. Wells took over the support of her siblings as a mere 16-year-old child. She convinced her extended family that it would be best if all the siblings would stay together, and somehow or another they agreed to let her be in charge. This eventually necessitated Wells' move to Memphis, Tennessee for a teaching job. Now, just among us, she lied about her age so she could get the position. There must have been something convincing about her presence. This trip to Memphis led to a defining and unexpected moment in her own life. I will call this moment an open moment. They occur in each of our lives, open moments when we have a choice to hear the deep call within, open moments when we have a choice to respond to the deep call within us. When Wells rode that train to Memphis for her teaching job, it was on one of these trains that the incident happened where she was ordered to move to the, quote, black car, and then she was thrown off the car when she refused to do so. Now, Wells could have just left it at that. She could have just succumbed to the narrative or the reality of her time that things like this happen to black people. Instead, she tapped into an inner strength and conviction that was stronger than convention. She sued the train company, and behold, the judge ruled in her favor. This is a chance for us to applaud, However, subsequently, this decision was appealed and then overturned when it went to the Tennessee Supreme Court. This overturning of the decision in favor of racial discrimination, remember, we are talking about being thrown off of a train here. This was a defining moment for her. This was an open moment in which she could dare to hear the call and dare to respond. Ida B. Wells looked beyond the incident to a larger implications, and she didn't brush off the defeat and then retreat. Beyond the external event was the meaning of the broader meaning of that singular event. Ida B. Wells continued to awaken and to call others to the awakening of the gap between the promise and the reality, between law and the upholding of those laws, between espoused justice and the cruel usurpation of that justice in the everyday experiences of those who knew about justice denied. She called for a boycott. She wrote about her experiences in her own paper, The Free Speech. So having heard this much about Ida B. Wells, having come this far in her narrative, let's see what wisdom we might be able to draw so far from the story, the surface of her life, for our own lives as well. So, friends, how do we cultivate that vision in us that can see not just an isolated incident of injustice, but the broader meaning and the implications of just a singular incident? How do we have that kind of perception? What is it that keeps us engaged in the work of justice and equity, even when we experience an apparent defeat? What strengths of spirit do we draw upon that keep us relentlessly engaged rather than gradually retreat? These might just be rhetorical questions that Reverend Larry is asking us right now. He doesn't really mean for us to spend time to think about this, does he? Yes, he does. He does. And we can't necessarily think about it all right now in this moment, but I ask you to ponder these questions as we have the continual dialogue with Ida B. Wells's life. These are among the questions that could prompt us into that dialogue with this open moment in Ida B. Wells's life, but also the open moment within our own life as well. Now, the next big tragic event that propelled Ida Wells into becoming a voice and an advocate for justice occurred in Memphis in March 1892. 3 men she knew were lynched. In fact, she was the godmother of the daughter of one of the men, Tom Moss. What was the crime that these 3 men, I need to quote from a book by Ida B. Wells, a book entitled Passionate for Justice, to convey to you what may otherwise seem unfathomable. So I quote, "The 3 African Americans were running a successful grocery store in competition with a white-owned store across the street in a black neighborhood. The owner of the white store gathered a mob to attack their rival store, and the African Americans returned fire when they were attacked. 3 white men were wounded, but none were killed. 31 African Americans were arrested, but later they were all removed from the jail by masked raiders. 3 of them, including Ida Wells' good friend Tom Moss, were executed by lynching." Again, in this defining and open moment in her life, she decided to respond. In fact, her investigative journalism became well known and respected, and is still a legacy that contemporary journalists still learn from. She began a study of 728 lynchings over the previous 10 years, and she used white newspapers as her primary sources, and her findings were astonishing to all. In May 1892, she wrote about these lynchings and published a blistering editorial about the real purpose for lynching black people. Most upsetting to some was her implication that some of the liaisons between black men and white women were consensual and not rape. That was hard for some to understand at the time. After this issue of Free Speech paper came out, her offices were burned to the ground. She learned about this while on a trip to New York, and knowing that her own life was threatened, she never returned to the South until 30 years later in 1922. So think about that. Think about that disruption. Think about the cost that came from her responding to that open moment and deciding to respond to the call rather than to retreat from it. In spite of the threats and the losses that she experienced, she became a leading national advocate of anti-lynching. She even went to England, which did a lot of cotton business with the South. And she shared these stories. And she had personal meetings with many in the government. And she wrote articles for their newspapers to expose this truth. Keep in mind, she was writing for those who did not know what was occurring, so that they would. So our dialogue with her life has to include these questions that take us into our time. What are the voices and the experiences that must be heard now? How do our current practices of journalism serve the path of justice or distract us from it? At an inner level, what have been the events in our own lives that may not be as tragic as those that Ida Wells experienced, but have also propelled us into giving voice to what otherwise might not be more fully known? And where does that strength come from within you that strengthens and cultivates courage and relentlessness in the face of injustice? Ida B. Wells also addressed the women's issues of her time. She was active in the women's suffragist movement. She started women's clubs all over the country to mobilize women to work for equity in the local, the state, and the national level. She also started the National Conference of Colored Women and was joined by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a member of the Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, and Harriet Tubman, who together fought to struggle against the reinstatement of neo-slavery under Jim Crow, what one author calls slavery by another name. Now, later in her life in Wilmington, North Carolina, when white citizens staged a coup d'etat that overcame the legitimately elected black city government, killing many black citizens in the process, Ida Wells appealed to William McKinley to intercede, but he refused. So she wrote about it. She talked about it. She told the story. Her perceived radicalism did not win favor among some other black leaders who at the time didn't want to upset things too much, particularly with those who were in power, those they were trying to persuade. And then Ida B. Wells did return to the South in January 1922 to visit 12 African-American men who had been arrested and accused of murder in a riot that history shows were actually started by, quote, white marauders. She disguised herself as a cousin of one of the men in order to protect herself by being recognized. Did I tell you she was only 5 feet tall? She may seem like a giant from what I've been saying about her. And after talking to the men in the jail and listening to their stories, after taking many notes, she listened as they sang some spirituals. And then she did some reconstruction of Christian theology right on the spot. She said, "I've been listening to you for nearly 2 hours. You've talked and sang and prayed about dying and forgiving your enemies and of feeling sure that you're going to be received in the New Jerusalem, heaven, because your God knows that you are innocent of the offense for which you expect to be electrocuted. But why don't you pray to live and ask to be freed?" She said to them, "The God you serve is the God of Paul and Silas who opened their prison gates. And if you have all the faith you say you have, you ought to believe that he will open your prison doors too. Quit talking about dying," she said. "If you believe your God is all powerful and believe that he is powerful enough to open these prison doors, then say so." Turns out she was very prophetic. Because, as it turns out, this case, Moore versus Dempsey, was the first case in the 20th century to be considered by the Supreme Court focusing on the rights of African Americans in the South in criminal matters. And eventually, the 12 were freed because it was recognized that their constitutional rights had been denied. So, as you can see, Ida Wells was a mighty voice for justice, for the rights of women and the rights of the poor. She was able to see how the gaps between the espoused values and the actual experience that she was able to see those gaps that many ignored. She was able to see the systems that upheld neo-slavery of her time and the continual denial of the death of African Americans through injustice. She spoke truth to power, even when her voice was considered too radical or that it might upset even some of those who served in coalitions with her. Hers was a faith that believed it was important to have faith in the here and now. Liberation now, release from the prison gates, literal or systemic, gates that suppress the dignity of others. And now is the open moment. Now is our own moment to decide what are the ways that we can carry forward the legacy of Ida B. Wells as a truth teller and a justice seeker. What are the ways that we can tap into our own individual and collective calls to be and to do what we are called to do as we listen deeply to our own time? What are the ways that we can carry forward the legacy of First Unitarian Church of Wilmington and can dare to continue to be a beacon for all humanity, even when for some despair threatens to extinguish hope, even when overwhelm for some lures them towards retreat. I couldn't help but finish this sermon and listen to a song, one of my favorite songs in ragtime. If you know what stirs your preacher's spirit every now and then, that Aretha Franklin version of the ragtime Make Them Hear You song is so stirring. I won't sing it. But I want to close with just this verse from the song. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Your sword can be a sermon or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous ones. Make them hear you. And when they hear you, I'll be near you. And I sensed Ida B. Wells' spirit when I heard that particular verse. I'll be near you. Amen.
You may have heard that song earlier in the month. And we've taken for our theme, for our annual stewardship campaign, the line from this song by the folk duo Ma Muse. It is time now that we thrive. And isn't it fitting that a song is the inspiration for our campaign? Because music in this church is something I can speak to with some authority. I first came to this church in 1994 to sing in the choir. And at that time, I didn't know I'd still be here 30 years later. So you may have noticed how robust our music program has grown in the past few years. After a couple 1-2 punches, it continues to provide musical opportunities for a growing number of congregation members, as well as outreach into the greater Wilmington community. Our fabulous Ms. Kathy Harris works with Reverend Larry Pierce and guest worship leaders to curate music for Sunday services. And on Sunday mornings, she plays organ and piano, leads the choir, and sings like an angel. She also works together with Cindy Cohen, props, to provide music for the monthly Vespers services. The choir's back with 22 active members, singing 2 to 3 Sundays each month. And on Sundays when the choir is not participating in the service, we have a soloist serving as hymn leader. It helps the hymn singing be more audible for the people on the recording and for those participating virtually, and provides music leadership for us sitting here in the sanctuary. You enjoyed the dulcet tones of our children's choir, the enthusiasm of them shouting, with the cooperation of CYRE Director Catherine Williamson and our own First U member Sarah Barlow, who I hope you feel better, Sarah, with the assistance of Pam Finkelman. And Cindy today, too, stepping in and stepping up. In addition to the choirs, you may have enjoyed our women's trio, comprised of 3 musically talented choir congregation members who are not able to be part of the choir, Leah Orchinik and Jackie Lukowski, and again, Sarah Barlow. And you may also have noticed an instrumental combo performing every now and then. Our Sunday afternoon concert series has been growing and engaging more people from the larger community as well. Music brings people here, and it keeps us here. And we could still do more with a more robust budget. Handbell choir? Sure, I'd love it if we had one, and I'd totally be there for that. But remember, despite all Kathy is able to accomplish, I mean, you heard that impressive list of offerings of our music program, our music director position is currently only part-time. It's easy to forget that. But music thrives here with your financial support. And music, in turn, helps us thrive individually and as a community. You can make your pledge for the coming fiscal year online, or talk to the folks at the stewardship campaign table in the parish hall after the service. You don't need to commit right then. They'll give you some stuff to take home and mull it over. And meanwhile, in the here and the now, the daily demands of maintaining our building and paying our staff and meeting all our commitments continue. So please be generous with your offering today. If you're in the sanctuary, you can leave your offerings in the basket at the back. You can also pull out your phone and use the app. We won't be insulted if you do that while we sing. And if you're online or in person, all the options for making your contributions will be on the screens during the offertory music. So please join me now in dedicating our offering to the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action. We dedicate our lives, and these are offerings. May we go forth to meet oppression with freeing justice, hatred with healing love, and despair with unfailing faith. May it be so. Amen.
So, as we conclude our service and before we do our final hymn, make sure that you take a moment to greet folks around you as the service concludes. Introduce yourself to anyone who might be a newcomer to you, and join us for snacks. The snacks we have today would put any Super Bowl table to shame. So please join us for an abundance of snacks. These benediction words come from Ida B. Wells, who said, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. Amen.